On Christmas Eve, my father stood beneath the soft glow of white string lights in their Aurora living room and announced the creation of the Brooks Family Trust as if it were the final ornament on a perfectly decorated tree. He raised his glass, cleared his throat, and declared that my younger brother Mason would be the sole heir to the Brooks legacy. Everyone clapped. My mom dabbed at her eyes. Mason smiled like a man who had just inherited a kingdom. I had been sending $3,200 every month for 4 years to keep that house from foreclosure. Mortgage, property taxes, insurance, repairs. I never missed a transfer, not once. My name was never mentioned. Hours later, Mason posted a photo of the three of them standing in front of the Christmas tree. The caption read, "Legacy Builders Only." I tapped like, then I commented, "Congrats! That equity and refinance are yours to handle now." 10 minutes later, the post vanished. 20 missed calls, more than 100 text messages. And for the first time in my life, I understood something clearly. They weren't panicking about my feelings. They were panicking about the structure. I was back in my Denver condo when the notifications started flooding in, my phone vibrating against the marble countertop like it was trying to crawl away. Mom called 5 times in a row, Dad twice. Mason left a string of texts that shifted from irritation to urgency within minutes. "Call us immediately. This isn't funny. Why would you say that publicly?" I didn't respond. I watched the screen light up and go dark, light up and go dark. The only thing I had done was mention 2 words: equity and refinance. Words that don't sound emotional. Words that sound technical, structural. People don't delete celebratory legacy posts over hurt feelings. They delete them when someone points at the foundation. 4 years earlier, the foundation had nearly collapsed. Dad's retail investment in Aurora had failed spectacularly. Within months, the primary residence was facing foreclosure. I still remember the late-night call from Mom. Her voice was tight, controlled. "It's just temporary," she said. "We just need help stabilizing things." There was no contract, no promissory note, just family obligation. I set up automatic transfers, $3,200 each month. Mortgage principal and interest. Back property taxes. Escrow shortages. As a forensic accountant in Denver, I understood risk exposure better than anyone in my family. I understood amortization schedules. I understood leverage. I also understood trust. I chose trust. Mason, meanwhile, built a different narrative. He worked at a real estate development office in Aurora and filled his social media with phrases like generational wealth and asset positioning. He spoke about legacy the way some people speak about faith. He loved photographs of himself standing in front of properties he did not own. At dinner that night, Dad had used similar language. "Irrevocable trust," he said. "Estate planning, asset protection." Mom nodded proudly beside him. Mason rested one hand on Dad's shoulder like a silent endorsement. I had listened carefully. Irrevocable meant permanent. Asset protection meant insulation. Sole heir meant exclusion. I did not interrupt. I did not confront them. I watched Mason's expression when Dad announced the trust structure. I watched Mom's relief. I watched the way no one looked at me when beneficiary designation was discussed. They had formalized something that had been happening quietly for years. After the comment, Mason texted me privately. "Don't start something you can't finish." That was the first honest sentence of the night. Near midnight, after the calls slowed, I sent a simple email requesting a full copy of the trust document. Mom replied within minutes. "It's standard estate planning. Stop being dramatic." Standard, dramatic. Words designed to shrink questions. A few minutes later, a PDF attachment arrived. Brooks_family_trust_final_signed.pdf. I opened it slowly, scrolling past the title page, past the section naming Mason as sole beneficiary, past the schedule listing the Aurora property and its current equity valuation. My pulse remained steady. Numbers calmed me. Documents calmed me. Then I reached the appendix. Consent to transfer equity. My full legal name appeared above a digital signature. The timestamp showed it had been executed 2 months earlier. I stared at the screen, at the shape of the signature. It looked almost right, almost like mine. But I knew something with a certainty that settled deep in my chest. I had never signed it. I zoomed in on the digital signature until the pixels blurred into tiny squares of light. My name was spelled correctly. The curve of the N looked almost natural. The tail on the last letter dipped the way mine usually did. Almost, but not exactly. The spacing was too tight, the pressure pattern too uniform. It looked like someone had copied a version of my signature and pressed it flat. I downloaded the document and opened the metadata panel. Created 2 days before Dad filed the refinance paperwork. Modified, multiple edits within a 10-minute window late on a Thursday afternoon. The digital certificate attached to the signature listed an IP address in Aurora, not Denver, not my condo, not my office network. I pulled up my calendar for that day. I had been in a conference room downtown, leading an audit review for a commercial client. My badge entry logs would prove it. My phone location history would prove it. I knew that before I even checked. My heart didn't race. It narrowed. I searched the embedded certificate more closely. The authorization was tied to an email address connected to the old shared cloud drive I had set up for Dad when the mortgage crisis first hit. He had told me it would simplify document transfers. I had created a shared login so he wouldn't struggle with uploads. Trust had become access. Access had become vulnerability. I picked up my phone and called Mom. She answered on the second ring. "You're still upset about last night?" she asked, as if the problem were tone, not structure. "I'm looking at the consent to transfer equity," I said evenly. "When did I sign this?" A pause. "It's just standard estate planning paperwork," she replied. "You're reading too much into it." "Did you see me sign it?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "You've always trusted us," she said. "Why are you attacking your brother?" I wasn't attacking anyone. I was identifying discrepancies. "I never signed this," I said. Her voice sharpened. "You always make everything transactional. It's Christmas." The call ended without resolution. I sat back in my chair and opened the county public records database. Within minutes, I found the refinance filing. Submitted 48 hours after the trust formation date. The loan amount had increased. The equity position had been leveraged more aggressively than before. If the house's equity had been transferred into an irrevocable trust naming Mason sole beneficiary, then legally, control had shifted. And yet my prior financial exposure as a guarantor on earlier mortgage paperwork was still present in historical records. They had shifted ownership without shifting risk. I checked the notary block on the trust document. Rebecca Halpern. The name was familiar. She had attended Mason's birthday party last spring. I remembered because she'd spent half the night talking about real estate licensing renewals. I looked her up in the state registry. Active commission. Office address matched the brokerage where Mason worked. The IP address tied to my alleged signature traced back to the same commercial region. This wasn't a coincidence. It was proximity. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had I clicked something digitally without noticing? Had I approved a DocuSign email while distracted? I searched my inbox for keywords. Trust, equity, consent, transfer. Nothing legitimate surfaced. What I did find was a password reset notification from the shared cloud drive 3 months earlier. The reset had been initiated from an Aurora network. I had ignored it at the time, assumed Dad had forgotten his login. I called him. He sounded tired. "It was just to streamline things," he said when I mentioned the signature. "You know we'd never hurt you." "Did you watch me sign that document?" I asked. He hesitated. I could hear the television in the background. "You've always trusted us," he said finally. "That's not what I asked." Silence settled between us. He didn't deny the document. He didn't confirm the signature. He simply rested on the idea that my trust should cover the gap. After we hung up, I opened a blank document on my laptop and typed a title across the top: Preliminary Fraud Indicators, Brooks Trust. I listed them methodically: unauthorized digital signature, IP mismatch, notary conflict of interest, refinance timing anomaly, beneficiary concentration shift. I stared at the list and felt something colder than anger: recognition. If they had replicated my authorization once, what else had been altered? Before closing my laptop, I logged into my life insurance portal. It was something I rarely checked because the beneficiary designation had never changed since I set it up years ago. The policy value glowed on the screen: $750,000. I clicked the beneficiary tab: Mason Brooks. Effective date: 6 months earlier. Authorization method: electronic signature. The air in my condo felt thinner. I checked my email for any confirmation notice from that date. Nothing. The digital certificate attached to the beneficiary change looked structurally identical to the one on the trust document. Same formatting, same Aurora region trace. I leaned back slowly, staring at the screen. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. I didn't sleep. By the time dawn broke over Denver, I had both digital certificates open side by side on my screen: the equity transfer consent from the Brooks Family Trust, the life insurance beneficiary change from 6 months earlier, different documents, different institutions, identical structure. The timestamp windows were both within normal business hours. The IP traces both pointed back to Aurora commercial networks. The formatting of the digital signature blocks was almost mechanically consistent, like someone had duplicated a template. I opened a spreadsheet and built columns: document name, execution date, IP address, authorizing email, financial outcome. Every row told the same story. Control shifted toward Mason. My name attached as consenting party. No direct confirmation from me. This wasn't one questionable signature. It was coordinated redistribution. I called the life insurance provider as soon as their office opened. After navigating through automated prompts, I reached a compliance representative. I requested authentication logs for the beneficiary update. She asked a series of identity verification questions before placing me on hold. When she returned, her tone changed slightly. The authorization was processed through electronic consent using the primary account credentials, she said. "Was two-factor authentication used?" I asked. "No, ma'am, it appears not." I closed my eyes briefly. The primary account credentials were tied to the same shared family access I had set up years earlier, the same login Dad insisted we keep active in case of emergencies, the same one that had triggered a password reset notice from Aurora 3 months ago. "Can you confirm the IP region of the authorization?" I asked. "It traces to Aurora, Colorado." "Not Denver." I thanked her and ended the call. For a few seconds, I just sat there staring at the wall. Then something shifted. I stopped thinking like a daughter. I started thinking like an investigator. I searched for an estate litigation attorney in Denver who specialized in trust invalidation and forgery disputes. I found one with a record of handling complex, irrevocable trust challenges. I called his office and secured an appointment for the following morning. That decision felt heavier than any document I had opened. Dad had once told relatives, half joking, "Natalie would never sue us. She's too loyal. I wondered how much of their risk calculation had relied on that assumption. The attorney's office was quiet, neutral, lined with leather-bound volumes that carried the weight of precedent. I placed my folder on his desk and slid each document across carefully. The trust formation paperwork, the equity transfer appendix bearing my digital signature, the refinance filing, the life insurance beneficiary change. He studied them without interruption, flipping pages, examining the signature certificates. "This indicates potential coordinated forgery," he said finally. The words were clinical. Not dramatic, coordinated. He outlined the legal path in steady terms. Petition to invalidate trust, motion for forensic signature examination, request for criminal referral. Each phrase landed like a door closing. He pulled the refinance timeline from public filings and aligned it with the trust formation date. 48 hours separated the two. Equity transferred into an irrevocable trust naming Mason sole beneficiary. Then the refinance application submitted with increased leverage. If the refinance had closed under those conditions, he said, control of the underlying asset would be structurally insulated. Insulated from me. The trust structure would have reclassified the property's equity into a vehicle where Mason stood alone as beneficiary. My 4 years of $3,200 monthly payments would have effectively stabilized an asset being redirected away from me. I felt the clarity settle like ice water. I wasn't being excluded from inheritance. I was being engineered out of position. "There's more," I said, sliding the life insurance beneficiary update across the desk. He scanned it, then compared the signature block to the one on the trust consent. "The similarity is notable," he said. Notable. Professional language for disturbing. He explained that filing a petition would automatically notify the bank handling the refinance. The lender's compliance division would likely freeze the process pending investigation. If the refinance collapsed, the mortgage structure would revert to its prior terms. With escrow shortages unresolved and rate adjustments approaching, default risk would increase. "If you pursue this," he said, "you may destabilize the property." I understood the implication immediately. If I pursued justice, the house could fall into financial distress. If I stayed silent, the fraud would solidify into legitimacy. My phone buzzed while we were still seated in his office. A notification from Mason's social media. He had posted again. "Some people destroy legacy out of jealousy," the caption read. Comments flooded in. Extended family praising his commitment to generational wealth, Mom replying with hearts and references to sacrifice. I didn't respond. Silence can be tactical. That afternoon, I printed 4 years of bank statements. Every transfer of $3,200 highlighted in yellow. I totaled the contributions. The sum was not symbolic. It was measurable. It was significant. My money had preserved the asset now being reallocated. That was not favoritism. That was financial extraction. The next morning, I signed the engagement agreement with the attorney. Petition to invalidate trust filed. Motion for forensic signature examination submitted. Life insurance provider formally notified of beneficiary dispute. As I stepped outside into the cold Denver air, snow beginning to fall lightly, my phone buzzed again. A notification from the bank. Refinance application under review due to active legal dispute. I stared at the message for a long moment. This was no longer a Christmas Eve insult. It was structural collapse in motion. 2 days after the petition was filed, Mason posted a long message about protecting generational wealth from internal sabotage. He never used my name. He didn't have to. The photo showed him standing in front of the Aurora house, one hand in his coat pocket, the other resting on the porch railing. "Legacy isn't built by the weak," the caption read. "Some people mistake support for ownership. Within minutes, relatives began commenting, "Stay strong. Family should stay united. So proud of you for stepping up." Mom replied publicly with a red heart and the words, "We raised both our children with love." I read every word without responding. The legal battle had crossed into narrative territory. They were shaping perception while I was building a case. That afternoon, my attorney called. "The refinance has been formally flagged," he said. "The bank's compliance division requested clarification on the equity transfer due to your petition." In other words, the structure had cracked. If the refinance failed, the adjustable rate on the existing mortgage would reset in 6 months. Escrow shortages were already thin. Without refinance proceeds, liquidity tightened. I didn't celebrate. I calculated. Mom called shortly after. "You've made this public," she said, her voice brittle. "Your father's blood pressure spiked last night." "I didn't make anything public," I replied. "I filed a petition." "You embarrassed us," she snapped. "People are asking questions." "Did you know about the beneficiary change on my life insurance?" I asked. Silence pressed into the line. "You always make everything transactional," she said finally. "Why can't you just be a daughter?" I hung up before she could reframe it again. 2 days later, Dad asked to meet halfway between Aurora and Denver. A small cafe just off the highway. Neutral ground. He was already seated when I arrived, papers stacked neatly in front of him. He looked older than he had on Christmas Eve. "Mason needs stability," he said after a few minutes of small talk that fooled neither of us. "You've always been independent, as if competence disqualified me from protection." I placed a printed summary of my transfers on the table. 4 years of $3,200 payments, highlighted totals, amortization impact. "You didn't build a legacy," I said quietly. "You built a funding structure." He flinched at the phrasing. "That's unfair," he said. "Is it?" He looked down at the numbers. "You would never take this to court," he said, almost to himself. "I already have," I replied. The words settled between us like a final signature. Later that evening, I ran a deeper search through public filings and business registrations. Mason's name appeared on a pending development partnership tied to a small mixed-use project on the edge of Aurora. The loan application referenced personal asset positioning. The trust documentation strengthened his financial profile. The house equity had become leverage. If the trust was invalidated, his leverage ratio collapsed. This wasn't about inheritance decades from now. It was about capital access now. The trust wasn't sentimental. It was collateral packaging. The next morning, my attorney informed me that subpoenas had been approved. Mason would be deposed under oath. So would the notary, Rebecca Halpern. Sworn testimony changes tone. Mason texted me that afternoon. "You're overreacting. We can settle this privately." I didn't respond. Extended family began messaging me directly. "Family should stay out of court. You're ruining Christmas forever. This will stain the Brooks name." It was always about the name, never about the signature. 2 days before the deposition notices were formally served, Mom called again. "Your father had to go to the hospital," she said. "His blood pressure is out of control." I closed my eyes briefly. "Is he stable?" "Yes," she said, "but the stress is too much." Forgery escalates itself, I wanted to say. Instead, I asked for the hospital name and ended the call. Mason sent another message an hour later. "If something happens to him, that's on you." For years, I had carried financial responsibility without recognition. Now I was being handed moral responsibility for consequences I hadn't engineered. That night, the bank sent a formal notice. Refinance application cannot proceed pending litigation resolution. I stared at the email and imagined Mason reading the same message. The next day, I learned his development partner had withdrawn conditional approval for the new project. Too much uncertainty. That evening, my phone rang again. Mason. I let it go to voicemail. "You have no idea what you're triggering," he said, his voice tighter than I had ever heard it. I listened twice. Then I placed my phone face down on the counter and stood in the quiet of my Denver condo. They weren't afraid of losing the house. They were afraid of losing control. The deposition room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Mason sat across from me in a tailored navy suit, posture straight, expression carefully neutral. A court reporter adjusted her headset. My attorney organized a stack of documents without looking up. When Mason raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, the word oath seemed to echo longer than it should have. He began confidently. "Yes, the Brooks Family Trust was created to protect family assets," he said. "It was Dad's idea, standard estate planning." "And the consent to transfer equity?" my attorney asked. Mason shifted slightly in his chair. "Natalie was aware." "Did you witness her signing the document?" "No," he said. "It was handled electronically." "Were you present when she authorized the transfer?" A pause. "No." The first fracture. The forensic IT consultant presented the metadata findings next. A projector hummed softly as the digital certificate appeared on the wall. "The IP address used to execute the electronic signature traces to an Aurora commercial network," the consultant said. "Specifically, the brokerage office where Mr. Mason Brooks is employed." Mason's jaw tightened. "And Ms. Natalie Brooks's device logs?" my attorney asked. "Her verified device activity places her in Denver during the timestamp window." Mason cleared his throat. "Maybe remote access," he said. The consultant shook his head. "There is no record of remote login from her registered devices." Silence pressed in from all sides. Next came the notary. Rebecca Halpern sat stiffly, hands folded too tightly in her lap. "You notarized the equity transfer document?" my attorney asked. "Yes," she replied. "Did you physically witness Ms. Natalie Brooks sign it?" Rebecca hesitated. "I relied on representation that the signature had been properly authorized." "So you did not verify her identity in person?" "No." The word landed heavy. Under oath, she admitted she had not followed standard identity verification procedures. She had trusted Mason's assurance. Trust again. Then my attorney introduced the life insurance beneficiary change. Mason's eyes flickered when the document appeared. "Were you involved in this update?" my attorney asked. "No," Mason said quickly. "I didn't even know about that." The forensic consultant compared the signature structures side by side. Identical formatting, identical certificate patterns, identical Aurora network trace. "Repeated authorization anomalies," my attorney said calmly. Mason's confidence began to thin. Dad's affidavit had already been submitted. He claimed he believed both his children understood the restructuring. That consent had been implied. Implied, not confirmed. During a brief recess, Mason stepped into the hallway where I stood alone. "This doesn't have to go criminal," he said quietly. It was the first time he had acknowledged the word. "You reused the authorization format," I said evenly. "You said that yourself." "That's not what I meant," he replied. "It was administrative. Faster. Faster than asking me?" His eyes flashed. "You're blowing this up." Forgery escalates itself, I thought. Back inside, the deposition resumed. Questions tightened. Language sharpened. Mason contradicted earlier statements about document handling timelines. The court reporter's fingers moved without pause. By the end, the room felt smaller. My attorney explained afterward that contradictory testimony strengthened grounds for summary invalidation of the trust. The notary's admission exposed procedural violation. The digital evidence aligned too cleanly to dismiss. We sent updated transcripts to the bank's compliance division. That evening, I received a voicemail from Mom. "You're destroying your brother's career," she said. "His development deal is suspended. Do you know what that means?" Yes, I knew exactly what that meant. It meant leverage had evaporated. It meant collateral had been questioned. It meant the structure was unstable without deception. Later that night, Mason called again. No arrogance this time. No legacy language. "We can fix this," he said, quietly. "How?" I asked. "We'll adjust the trust. We'll make it fair. Just withdraw the petition." There it was. Not an apology, a negotiation. "You don't want this to go further," he added. I looked out the window at the Denver skyline glowing faintly against the dark. For years, I had transferred $3,200 every month without being asked twice. I had assumed silence meant appreciation. Now silence meant leverage. "I didn't take this further," I said. "You did." He exhaled sharply. "You're risking everything." No, they had already risked everything when they signed my name. After I ended the call, I placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter and let the quiet settle. For the first time, Mason was not speaking like a future heir. He was speaking like someone calculating damage control. Mason chose a hotel bar in downtown Denver for the meeting. Neutral territory, dim lighting, polished marble. The kind of place where negotiations feel civilized. He was already seated when I arrived, a glass of water untouched in front of him. No social media confidence tonight. No legacy slogans. Just tension. "We can make this go away," he said as soon as I sat down. I didn't respond. I waited. "If you withdraw the petition and the forensic motion," he continued, lowering his voice, "we can settle this privately. You'll get compensated." "Compensated," I repeated. "For your contributions," he said. "We'll calculate it fairly." "How much?" He named a number. It was lower than the total I had transferred over 4 years. It didn't account for appreciation. It didn't account for leverage created through my payments. It accounted for silence. "You're asking me to legitimize the trust," I said. "No," he replied quickly. "Just stop escalating." He leaned forward. "You don't understand what's at stake. The development partner pulled out after the deposition transcript circulated. If this turns criminal, my real estate license is gone." There it was. Not regret, risk management. "You reused my authorization," I said. "It was faster," he replied before he could stop himself. "We were under time pressure." The words hung between us. I had already activated the voice recorder on my phone when I sat down. "Colorado allows one-party consent." I didn't interrupt him. "You were never supposed to see it this way," he added. "You always handled the numbers. You weren't supposed to question the structure." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, confirmation. The next morning, my attorney called. "The bank has officially denied the refinance," he said, "pending resolution of fraud allegations. And without the refinance proceeds, the adjustable rate would reset within months. Escrow deficiencies remained. The mortgage's stability depended on new liquidity that would no longer arrive. If the trust is voided and no new financing is secured," he said, "default risk increases. In other words, the house could fall." Mom called that afternoon, her voice trembling. "Your father hasn't slept," she said. "The neighbors are talking. Do you know how humiliating this is?" "Forgery isn't humiliation," I replied. "It's fraud." "You could have handled this privately," she said. "I tried," I answered. She didn't acknowledge that. Instead, she said, "If the house goes into foreclosure, how will you live with yourself?" The question lingered long after the call ended. I pulled up my bank records again. 4 years of $3,200 transfers, 48 payments, each one sent without documentation, without protection. The total exceeded the settlement offer Mason had proposed, but the number wasn't the real issue. If I accepted the settlement, the trust would remain structurally intact. The equity transfer would stand. The forged consent would remain part of legal history. My silence would become precedent. I met with my attorney later that week and played him the recording from the hotel bar. He listened without expression. "That's an admission of process deviation," he said. "Not a direct confession, but it strengthens our leverage." "Could we settle after invalidation?" I asked. "Yes," he replied, "but not before. If you withdraw now, you waive structural challenge." He used a phrase that lingered. "Void ab initio," he said, "invalid from the beginning." The trust would not be adjusted. It would be erased. Mason called again that night. "Are you withdrawing?" he asked. "No." "You're choosing money over family." I almost laughed at the symmetry of it. "For 4 years," I said quietly, "I funded the family." He didn't answer. "If the house defaults," he continued, voice tightening, "that's on you." For years, I carried the mortgage quietly. Now I was being handed responsibility for collapse engineered by deception. "I didn't design the structure," I said. "I just stopped funding it." After we hung up, I sent my attorney a brief email. "Proceed fully. Motion for summary invalidation confirmed. Criminal referral maintained." The court date was scheduled before Easter. That night, I stood in my quiet condo, city lights reflecting against the windows. There was no dramatic surge of satisfaction, no triumph. There was only clarity. They had built a financial dependency disguised as loyalty, and for the first time in my life, I was no longer paying to keep it standing. The courthouse steps were still wet from early spring rain when I arrived. Mason stood near the entrance with his attorney, posture rigid, expression carefully controlled. Mom sat on a bench just inside the lobby, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders slightly curved forward, as if something invisible had been pressing down on him for months. Inside the courtroom, everything felt colder than the air outside. My attorney spoke first, laying out the timeline with surgical precision. Formation of the Brooks Family Trust. The consent to transfer equity bearing my digital signature. The refinance filing 48 hours later. The life insurance beneficiary change executed months earlier. The forensic expert took the stand. He explained the metadata. The Aurora commercial IP trace, the structural duplication of the digital signature certificate across multiple documents, the absence of authentication from my verified devices in Denver during the timestamp windows. "In your professional opinion," the judge asked, "what does this indicate?" "High probability of unauthorized digital replication," he replied. "Not dramatic, not emotional, just factual." Rebecca Halpern followed. Under oath, she confirmed she had notarized the equity transfer document. When asked if she physically witnessed my signature, she hesitated. "I relied on representation," she said quietly. "Did you verify her identity in person?" the judge asked. "No." The courtroom grew still. False certification does not require shouting. It requires acknowledgement. Then Mason was called. He tried to steady his voice. "The trust was about asset protection," he said. "It was Dad's decision." "Did you facilitate the electronic execution of the equity transfer?" my attorney asked. "I helped process paperwork," he answered. The recording transcript was entered into evidence. The line from the hotel bar read aloud. "We reused the authorization format because it was faster." Mason shifted in his seat. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. "It was administrative." "Administrative?" the judge asked. "You replicated a digital authorization in her name." Mason didn't respond immediately. Dad took the stand reluctantly. He said he believed both of his children understood the restructuring. That consent had been implied. "Did you directly confirm written consent with your daughter?" the judge asked. "No," Dad said. He didn't look at me. When the judge began reading the ruling, the words felt both distant and sharp. "The court finds that the consent to transfer equity was executed without verified authorization," she said. "The digital signature authentication was compromised. The notarization procedure was improper." She paused briefly. "The Brooks Family Trust, as it pertains to the disputed equity transfer, is declared void ab initio, invalid from inception. The equity transfer was reversed. The life insurance beneficiary designation restored to its prior status. The fraudulent authorizations formally nullified." It was not a dramatic moment. There was no gasp, no collapse, just the sound of a pen scratching across official paper. Outside the courtroom, Mom approached me. "You could have handled this privately," she said, her voice trembling with anger rather than grief. "You've destroyed Mason's future." "Forgery doesn't stay private," I replied. Dad stood a few steps behind her, silent as always. Mason didn't say a word. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight, as if refusing to acknowledge gravity. Later that afternoon, the bank confirmed receipt of the court order. The refinance was officially terminated. The mortgage reverted to its original structure without the leverage of the invalid trust. Mason's development partner withdrew permanently. The house's financial stability, once propped up by engineered paperwork, was exposed. My attorney met me in his office to review next steps. "With the trust voided," he said, "your equity interest is restored. However, without refinancing, sustainability will be challenging." I knew what that meant. The adjustable rate reset was approaching. Escrow shortages remained unresolved. Without continued intervention, default risk increased. "I won't resume payments," I said quietly. He nodded. We initiated formal proceedings to list the property for sale under clean title conditions. Asset liquidation, no further entanglement. When I stepped outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but lighter. My phone buzzed with a bank notification confirming the judicial determination had been logged into their compliance system. I looked back once at the building behind me. Winning did not feel like revenge. It felt like subtraction. The trust was void. The illusion that silence meant consent was void. The assumption that loyalty guaranteed compliance was void. For the first time in 4 years, I was no longer financially tethered to a structure built on my signature without my permission. I walked down the steps without looking for anyone to follow. The for sale sign went up on the Aurora house on a quiet Tuesday morning. No family meeting, no dramatic goodbye. Just a clean listing agreement signed with verified identification this time. Every signature witnessed properly, every page double-checked. I drove past once before the open house weekend. The porch light was off. The lawn looked trimmed but tired, like it had been holding its breath for months. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. That house had never been legacy. It had been leverage. The bank supervised the process closely. With the trust declared void ab initio and the equity transfer reversed, the asset was clean again. My financial contributions over 4 years were quantified, documented, acknowledged in numbers, instead of dismissed in conversation. When the property closed, the proceeds were distributed according to restored ownership percentages. My portion transferred directly into my account without debate, without guilt, without late-night calls. For the first time, the math spoke louder than the narrative. Mason moved into a rented condo across town. I heard through quiet channels that his development partnership dissolved permanently. Lenders do not like risk tied to fraudulent authorization. Reputation travels faster than apology. Rebecca Halpern's notary commission was placed under review. I never followed up on the final outcome. It wasn't my responsibility to track consequences anymore. Mom stopped calling. Dad sent one email. "I never thought you'd go this far." I read it twice. Then I closed the message without responding. For years, I had gone further than anyone asked. Further financially, further emotionally, further in silence. This time, I had simply drawn a line. I bought a townhouse in Lakewood that spring. Smaller, brighter, entirely in my name. No shared credentials, no secondary access, no emergency login that could be repurposed into consent. The first evening I unlocked the door, the place smelled like fresh paint and dust. I set my keys on the kitchen counter and stood in the quiet. No mortgage drama, no escrow shortage, no hidden refinance filings, just clean walls and a blank ledger. I assembled my own dining table that weekend. It took longer than I expected. At one point, I laughed at myself, kneeling on the floor with an instruction manual spread open, Allen wrench in hand. Ownership feels different when it isn't entangled. My first mortgage payment posted automatically from my account 2 weeks later. I watched the transaction clear and felt something settle. This payment was chosen, not extracted. Months passed. One evening, Mason texted unexpectedly, "I hope you're satisfied." I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Satisfaction had never been the goal. Clarity was. On the first Christmas after the ruling, snow fell again outside my Lakewood windows. I brewed coffee and watched it gather on the sidewalk below. I thought about the previous Christmas Eve. The speech, the applause, the words "soul heir" echoing under twinkle lights. I opened my archive screenshots and scrolled to the image Mason had once posted. Legacy builders only. The post was gone from his feed, but the memory of it remained clear. They had believed legacy meant control. I had learned legacy means boundaries. For years, I thought love meant sacrifice without documentation. I believed loyalty meant absorbing financial risk quietly. I mistook silence for stability. But silence can be expensive, and consent must be explicit. I don't hate my family. I don't even feel anger anymore. What I feel is distance. Clean, measurable distance. The kind that lets you sleep without checking your phone for crisis notifications at midnight. Revenge, I realized, was never about destroying them. It was about refusing to fund a structure built on deception. It was about reclaiming my name. If you found your own signature forged inside your family's trust, would you stay quiet to keep the peace? Or would you risk everything to protect your future? Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. I read every story, and I know many of you have faced your own inheritance battles, your own hidden truths behind holiday smiles. If stories about family betrayal, legal justice, and reclaiming your financial independence resonate with you, stay here. Subscribe. There are more stories where the quiet one isn't powerless, just patient. Legacy isn't what they promise you under Christmas lights. It's what you refuse to let them take. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.